Hello, book lovers and English learners. Welcome to our October live read along. I'm Lydie Bureau and I'm an English teacher in France. I'm also the founder of Lydie's Book Club, a book club for learners of English. And in this book club, I host live readings and workshops on adaptations of classics of literature and contemporary novels in their original texts. I also tend to prioritize books that are written by women. Each month, we read and explore a different book for all levels of English. And at the end of each reading week, I meet the members of the book club in a live workshop via Zoom to discuss the chapters read over that week. And this month, we are reading the C1 Advanced Adaptation of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a 2008 Penguin Readers edition, so quite an old one. And if you want to know more about the novel and about Elizabeth Gaskell's work, I invite you to listen to the podcast episode 25, An Introduction to Elizabeth Gaskell and North and South, which is available here on this YouTube channel and also on Spotify podcast Read in English. So today it is our fifth live reading session, and we are going to read chapters 9 and 10. So I hope that you are up to date with your reading. On the 2nd of November, so in 2 weeks, I will host the third live workshop session that will be based on chapters 9 to 10. So the chapters that we're going to read today, this week, not today. Today is just 9 and 10. So if you want to attend this live session, you just need to subscribe to the book club, and you can find the link in the description of this video. And on my website, you will find all the upcoming dates of the live readings and upcoming workshops. So in total, there are going to be 4 workshops based on this book. So, or around, I would say, around this book. So we've done 2 already. So if you want to still attend the workshop, you can still do it. So please, by all means, join us. So when you that's it. So last thing, I am pleased to announce that now you can purchase the 2-part live workshop of Rebecca. So Rebecca is the book. Where it is? Where is it? It's here. Sorry, I was not prepared. So Rebecca is the adaptation that we read in September. This is our September live read along, and you can now purchase the 2-part workshop sessions that we did around this book. You don't need to become a member to purchase the sessions of the workshops. You just need to buy if you just want to buy the workshop, then you can just do it. And after that, you'll be asked to create a login, which will give you access to a private space for you to watch the videos and just do it at your own pace and logging and log back whenever you want. So for that, sorry, you can find the link in the description of this video as well. So if you are interested in knowing more about Rebecca and Daphne du Maurier's work and learn and have a sense of what it's like to be part of Lydia's book club, then I recommend you to purchase this live workshop. And yeah, and dive into the book as well. So as always, I'm doing a quick recap as I usually do. I recap the last chapters of the book that we've read. So last week, We read last Thursday then. We read chapter 7 and 8. Yeah. So let me remind myself as well. It's going to be a good reminder for myself on the event of the story. So, chapter 7, Dangerous Times. So, in that chapter, um, it is the famous chapter in which the very um, um, the chapter where everything in which everything has been not everything, but Mr. Thornton reveals his feelings towards Margaret. So Margaret, if you remember, she she went to the Thorntons because her mother is really sick, and she went to the Thorntons to get a waterbed, which would help her mother getting better. And the only people who's got uh, a waterbed are the Thorntons. So she pays them a visit to get the waterbed. And at the same time, there is the strike happening at the doorsteps of the Thorntons' house. Because remember, they live just behind or next door the mill. So there are the workers at the door, and Mr. Thornton asks Margaret to leave the house, and because it's not safe, and he's worried uh, about her, and he doesn't want her to get hurt. But she doesn't leave the house. She doesn't move, and instead she asks him to go down and try to calm the workers down. Um, but instead, Mr. Thornton says the soldier are coming, so they called the army to stop the protest. And well, he says that, sorry, he says that before, and after that, actually, Margaret says, well, you should calm them down because, well, the soldiers took some time to arrive. So while in the meantime, you should go downstairs and calm them down. At first, is he doesn't say anything. Is kind of surprised that she would ask him this, and how concerned she is about the workers, but also about him in a way, because she sees that um, the workers outside are very angry. So he goes down in the end and eventually stands in front of them, but with arms folded like that. So not really, not very welcoming and not welcoming, but not a very positive attitude towards the workers. So, and he doesn't seem to show any understanding or in this attitude, I would say. So at some point, um, Margaret sees that there are some young protesters who are about to throw shoes and stones at him. So she goes down and she passed in front of him and tried to cover him and put her arms around him. But Mr. Thornton doesn't get hurt, but Margaret does, and she got hit by a stone. So she faints, of course, and Mr. Thornton put her on the side and take her and get upset, get upset against the protesters. Then the soldiers arrive, and he's free to look after Margaret. And then he reveals his love to her. Oh, Margaret, no one knows what you mean to me. You are the only woman I ever loved. So he declares his love to her, but she's unconscious, so she doesn't hear that. It's only when she wakes up, so he takes her upstairs in the house, and then he leaves the house. And it's only when she hears a servant talking to Fanny, so Mr. Thornton's sister, that she realizes that her action has been taken for a declaration, a form of a declaration of love or of feelings from her part to Mr. Thornton. So she's quite upset about the fact that people would think that of her, because she doesn't feel like she did it because she loves him. She appreciates him. She likes him in a way, but to the point of having feelings, she's not there yet. Or she's not there yet, we don't know. But she's not happy about what people say about this event and what they think of her. So she decides to leave the house and go home, and says that she feels better. But of course, she's still weak. Mrs. Thornton insists on letting her stay, on asking to stay, but Margaret doesn't want to alarm her parents, so she decides to go home and hides the blood on her head to her parents. So when Mr. Thornton comes back, she's gone, and he's furious because her mother let Margaret leave the house while she was weak and not. He knew that she wasn't feeling well, so he said that he would visit her the next day. So he did, of course. And here again, poor thing, he declared again to her his love. He declares his love to her, and he says, "I disagree," because he starts saying that he's grateful for her, and she replies immediately that, no, no, there's no reason to be grateful for me because I just did that. Any woman would have done the same. And he says, I disagree. I owe my life to you. Oh, Miss Hale, I owe everything to you, to the woman I love, as I have never loved a woman before. So here now she is wide awake, and she can hear his declaration. So he um, he overcome uh, his, um, his his shyness in a way, and or he gets the courage, I would say. He gets the courage to show his feelings to her. So uh, so unfortunately, she doesn't respond positively to his declaration, and instead she says that she would have done it to any other man, and that there's nothing special to him about him for her actions. So uh, she doesn't return the affection to him. So you can imagine that he's quite vexed. And later on in the chapter 8, he becomes much more distant to Margaret when he visits the hills, especially when he learns that he visits the family because he knows that her mother is really sick. So he decided to bring a basket of fruit to her frequently. And and of course he sees Margaret there. Margaret is quite try to make herself very small so that because she feels very uncomfortable now uh, when she sees him. Although she asks to remain friends, but as you can imagine, John is not so keen on moving on and just pretend. So he's distant towards her, and she notices the change of behavior in his on his side, and she, of course, her behavior as well. In the same time, her behavior changes as well towards him, knowing the feelings that he has towards her. Um, Then we learn in chapter 8 that Bessie has died. So remember, Bessie is the daughter of Nicholas Higgins, who is a factory worker and and a friend of Margaret, I would say. So she goes over to the Higgins to pay her respect and to support Nicholas in his grieving. In it, yeah, and and they start discussing about the strike and the fact that, well, clearly the workers lost the fight um, because they send the force, I mean the army, and they all got expelled and they from the premises of the factory, and they lost their jobs, and Higgins lost his job. Um, so Margaret invites Nicholas to their house, and Mr. Hale is happy to welcome him and advise and asks whether he would like him to talk to Mr. Thornton to maybe hire him. But Nicholas Higgins, with his pride, doesn't want Mr. Hale to talk for him, and he says that he will talk to Mr. Thornton himself. So here it is, the end of the main event in chapter 8. So now we can get started and read chapter 9. Mrs. Hale. Okay. Sorry. Right. Mrs. Thornton came to see Mrs. Hale the next morning. Mrs. Hale was much worse. A sudden change had taken place during the night, and now, with her grey face and hollow cheeks, she looked as if death could not be far away. Mrs. Thornton had not believed that Mrs. Hale was really ill, and she had only come because her son had insisted. But now that the reality of the younger woman's death was clear, she softened immediately. Mrs. Hale lay still, then, with a great effort, reached for her visitor's hand and whispered, "My child will be without a mother in a strange place. If I die, will you wish me to be your daughter's friend?" Mrs. Hale could not speak, but she pressed her visitor's hand. Mrs. Thornton sighed. It was difficult to say that she would be kind to Margaret, whom she disliked so much. "I'm not the kind of person who shows affection. Sorry. But I will be a true friend to Miss Hale. If she is in difficulty and comes to me for help, I will do everything I can for her. I also promise that if I ever see her doing something that I think is wrong, I will tell her, just as if she were my own daughter." There was a long pause. Mrs. Hale felt that this promise did not include everything, and she did not really understand why, but perhaps this was because she was very ill. "I thank you," she said. "I shall never see you again in this world, but I thank you for your promise of kindness to my child." "Not kindness," said Mrs. Thornton. But fortunately, Mrs. Hale did not hear her. Mrs. Thornton held that dying woman's hand for a moment and left the house without seeing anyone. Meanwhile, Margaret and Dixon were discussing how to keep Frederick's visit a secret from anyone except the family. A letter was expected any day, and he would certainly arrive soon afterwards. They decided that if Dixon needed help in the kitchen, they would ask Mary Higgins. They knew that if she met Frederick, who would be known as Mr. Dickinson, she would not be interested in finding out more about him. Poor Margaret! All that day she had to ignore her own feelings and look after her father, who sat in a sitting room with his head in his arms. From time to time, Mrs. Hale suffered terrible pain, but in the evening she slept, and Dixon sat with her. Darkness came. Margaret did not want to leave her father, and the lamps had not been lit. She was sitting at the window looking out at the street when suddenly the doorbell rang. She jumped up and went down to open the door. A tall man was standing there, but she could not see his face. "Margaret, is this Mr. Hales?" he said clearly. Margaret trembled all over, then whispered, "Frederick?" and held out her arms to him. They kissed each other. "Mother, is she alive?" "Yes, she is very ill, but she is alive. Thank God. Did you receive my letter?" "No, but we knew you would come." Margaret took Frederick to Mr. Hale's study and lit a lamp. Now she could see that his face was quite brown from the sun and that his eyes were very blue and bright. They did not exchange a word, but there was an immediate understanding between them, and Margaret's heart was much lighter as she went upstairs. It took Mr. Hale some time to understand that Frederick had come, and when he did, he began to cry like a child. Leaning on Margaret's arm, he went down to the study, and Margaret left him with Frederick. She ran upstairs and cried bitterly. It was the first time she had allowed herself this relief for days. Frederick had come. He was safe. She could hardly believe it. Feeling much better, she went into the kitchen, made the fire, lit lamps, and prepared food for the traveller. She came into the study, carrying the dishes like a servant, and Frederick immediately jumped to take them for her. It was typical of his loving behavior. Over the next few days. The brother and sister put some plates on the table, saying little, their hands touching, their eyes speaking to each other. They heard Dixon moving about in the kitchen, and Margaret went to tell her the news. Mrs. Hale was awake, but they decided that they would not tell her that Frederick had arrived until after Dr. Donaldson's visit in the morning. He would be able to tell them how to prepare her for seeing her son. Frederick and his father sat in the study talking while Margaret said nothing but listened quietly. It was a huge source of strength to her that her brother had come. She examined his appearance carefully and liked it. He had delicate features and a friendly, cheerful expression that could change suddenly and become very passionate. She could see that he understood his father's character and his weaknesses. He knew exactly how to talk to him and make him feel better. Perhaps because she was older now. The brother and sister felt closer to each other than ever before. When Mrs. Hale saw Frederick the next morning, she seemed to improve. She sat with his hands in hers and would not let go of it, even while she slept. "I'm very selfish," she said, "but it will not be for long." Frederick bent down and kissed the hand that imprisoned his. Kind Dr. Donaldson told Margaret that her mother did not have many hours to live, but Frederick could not believe it. That night, however, Mrs. Hale became unconscious and died before morning. Frederick, who had been so strong until then, now sobbed so violently that Margaret and Dixon feared that their next-door neighbors would hear him. Margaret sat with her father in her mother's bedroom, in her mother's room. He did not speak, but from time to time stroked his wife's face, making a soft sound like an animal with her young. He ignored Margaret completely, and her heart ached for him so much that she could not think of her. And her heart ached for him so much that she could not think of her own loss at all. Morning came, and Margaret did her household duties, her eyes almost blinded with tears. Her father and brother were so full of grief that she felt she had to look after them. She made breakfast and lit a fire, but the contrast between its bright cheerfulness and her own thoughts made her kneel by the sofa and cry into the cushions. Dixon found her there and spoke gently to her, and the old servant's kindness made her feel a little better. At breakfast, Mr. Hale did not seem to know where he was, and Frederick burst into tears. Afterwards, when Margaret tried to discuss the arrangements for the funeral, Mr. Hale understood almost nothing, but asked Margaret to write to his friend Mr. Bell in Oxford and tell him the news. Towards evening, Dixon told Margaret that she did not feel it was safe for Frederick to stay in Milton. She explained that while she was shopping, she had met a young man called Leonard, whose family she had known in Southampton. He was a sailor and had been on the Russell at the same time as Frederick. Although Dixon did not know if he had taken part in the mutiny, she had recognized Leonard's, and they had had a short conversation. He had asked about Frederick and talked about the mutiny, saying that Frederick would be hanged if he was caught. He said that £100 reward had been offered for catching Frederick, and suggested that Dixon could help to trap him, and that they would then share the reward. Dixon had never liked or trusted Leonard's. A story made Margaret feel very uncomfortable. "Have you told Frederick?" she said. "No, but I've told your father, and he thinks that Frederick must leave." The two women felt the same, but it was very hard for Margaret just when Frederick had returned to his family. She was sitting by the fire and thinking about this when Frederick came in. "How tired you look, Margaret," he said. "You've been looking after everybody and no one has looked after you. Lie on the sofa. There is nothing for you to do." Margaret gladly went to lie down, and the two began to talk on low tones. Margaret told Frederick Dixon's story, and he looked shocked. So if you remember, Frederick is on exile from England because he was a soldier in the army when he was younger, and he rebelled against his captain and started a mutiny. And when this happened, when they got back to England, well, before they got back to England, they threatened all the people who were involved in the mutiny, and especially him, because he started it, that he would be persecuted, arrested. He would be arrested, persecuted, and hanged. So he never returned to England. Instead, he left for America, and he ended in the south of Spain, in Cadiz. So he came back for his mother, but he came back illegally. And there is this Leonard's who's trying to bribe Dixon to get Frederick arrested, but of course Dixon cannot do that to the family and to Frederick. Leonard was the worst sailor on the ship and a really nasty fellow. All the sailors who had the right ideas were angry with the captain. But Leonard was always trying to please him. And he's here in Milton? If he knew I was here, he'll tell the police without a doubt. Mr. Hale heard what they were saying and came towards them, eager and trembling. He took Frederick's hands in his. "My boy, you must go. It is very bad, but you must. You have done all you could. You have been a comfort to your mother." "Perhaps I should stay and let them take me to court," said Frederick thoughtfully. "No, you must go." Frederick changed the subject. "Do you know, I was in my bedroom this afternoon and the doorbell rang. So I waited for some time until I thought the visitor had left. Then I opened the door and I saw a great, powerful fellow going down the stairs." "It was Mr. Thornton," said Mr. Hale. "Mr. Thornton?" said Margaret, a little surprised. "I thought you meant someone of a different class." Not a gentleman. He looked like someone who worked in a shop, said Frederick carelessly. But it seems he is a manufacturer. Margaret was silent, remembering how, before she knew Mr. Thornton well, she had thought of him in just the same way. Mr. Thornton was, sorry, uh, she has thought of him just in the same way. She wanted to make Frederick understand what kind of person Mr. Thornton was, but she could not think what to say. Mr. Hale continued, "He came to offer to help us, but I could not see him. I told Dixon to ask if he wished to see you, Margaret." Margaret was silent, and after some moments, Frederick said, "It is painful to think I can never thank those who have shown you kindness, but you could both come to Spain. I have a good job there and a promise of promotion. Margaret, I told you about Dolores Barber. She's not yet 18, but I hope that in a year she will be my wife. You would love her. If you knew her, I'm sure. If you came, you would have so many friends." "No, no more changes for me," said Mr. Hale. "Moving here has cost me my wife. I'm staying here." "Oh, Frederick, I'm so glad you have someone to love and to care for you out there," said Margaret. "I know you took part in the mutiny, but for Dolores' sake, perhaps you should try and prove that the most serious accusations are not true." A discussion began. Frederick did not know if it was possible to find the witnesses, all of them, all of them sailors, who could explain why the mutiny happened. "I don't think the attempt would be successful," he said doubtfully. "But could we not at least try to find them? There is a friend of mine, a lawyer, a very clever man, who would be happy to help you, Mr. Henry Lennox." "Father." Margaret blushed when she said this. "I think it is a good idea," said Mr. Hale, "but Frederick must not stay in England just to see him." "Listen to my plan," said Margaret. "Frederick, you could take the night train to London tomorrow and leave a note from me for Mr. Lennox at his home the following day. Then you could take the next boat from London." Mr. Hale and Frederick immediately agreed to the plan, and Frederick wrote down a list of sailors' names. Margaret wrote the note to Lennox, with Frederick looking over her shoulder, and she did not have time to worry about whether she was using the right words after the last difficult. About whether she was using the right words after the last difficult meeting. So remember, Henry Lennox was the first man to declare his love to Margaret, and she rejected him as well. And he is the brother-in-law of Edith, which is Margaret's cousin, who got married with Captain Lennox, and Henry Lennox is his brother. So they know each other. They've known each other for a long time, and they were friends. But when Margaret had to leave the London, her aunt's house, he visited her in Helston, and this is where he declared his love to her. But unfortunately, she did not return his love to him, and she rejected his proposal. The family sat together in the sitting room all the next day. Mr. Hale only spoke Mr. Hale only spoke when his children asked him questions. Frederick was now ashamed that he had allowed his grief to overcome him, and although his sorrow was very real, he did not speak about it again. Margaret was suffering more now and spent a lot of time crying. Mr. Hale and Margaret wanted to make sure that Frederick was safely on the on the night train to London, and they decided that Margaret would accompany him to Outwood Station. It was bitterly painful for Mr. Hale to say goodbye to his son, and Margaret hurried Frederick into the carriage that was taking them there. They arrived at the station quite early and went to walk in a field next to the station. They were talking about their father when a horse rider passed slowly by. The evening sun was shining directly on Margaret's face, and she bowed to the rider, who bowed stiffly back. "Who's that?" asked Frederick. "Mr. Thornton. You saw him before, you know," said Margaret, looking worried. By now it was time to return to the station, and Frederick went to buy his ticket. They were walking down the railway platform when they heard the sound of the approaching train. Just then a porter came up to them. It was clear that he was drunk, and he pushed Margaret to one side, then seized Frederick by his collar. "Your name is Hale, I believe?" When Frederick heard this, he immediately pushed the man away, and the porter fell off the platform, a distance of 3 or 4 feet. "Run, run," whispered Margaret urgently. "The train is here. It was Leonard's, wasn't it?" A carriage door was open, and Frederick jumped into the train. As he leaned out to say goodbye, the train started to leave, and Margaret was left standing alone. She felt so sick and faint that she went into the waiting room to sit down. When she felt a little better, she began to wonder if the man had been seriously hurt, and although she was frightened to do this, she went back to the platform to look for him. No one was there. She was trembling so much that she felt she could not walk home alone. She could not walk home along the dark, lonely road, and she decided to take the next train back. But supposing Leonard recognized her as Frederick's companion? Fortunately, when she went to get her ticket, there were only a few railway officials there, talking loudly to one another. "So Leonard has been drinking," said one of them. "He came in about 5 minutes ago with a story about how he'd fallen off the platform. He wanted to borrow some money to go to London by the next train. I refused, and he's gone off somewhere." "To have another drink, I guess," said another man. Frightened that Leonard would return, Margaret hid in the waiting room until the next train came. She was helped into the carriage by a porter whose face she did not dare to look at until the train started moving. Then she saw that it was not Leonard's. Right, and that's the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10. A police inspector. Home seemed unnaturally calm after Margaret's frightening experience at the station. Mary Higgins had come to work in the kitchen. Mr. Hale did nothing except sit in his chair in a kind of waking dream, and Margaret decided not to tell him about the incident at the station, as things had ended well. Although it was possible that Leonard would borrow money to go to London, it was unlikely that he would find Frederick there. Margaret decided not to worry about something she could do nothing to prevent, as in a day or two Frederick would be safely out of England. Mr. Hale had wanted Mr. Bell to come to the funeral, but his old friend sent an affectionate letter saying that unfortunately he was unwell and could not come, although he promised to visit in September. Mr. Hale decided to invite Mr. Thornton instead, but Margaret, who feared the idea of seeing Mr. Thornton again, begged her father not to ask him. And in the end, He agreed. The morning of the funeral arrived. Margaret had slept badly and was shocked to receive a letter from Frederick saying that Mr. Lennox was away and would not be back for another 2 days. Consequently, Frederick had decided to stay in London until his return. His decision made Margaret very anxious. If Lennox had gone to London, he now had more time to find Frederick. He had more time to find Frederick, but she could not think about this for long. Her father was almost too weak to get into the funeral carriage, and he needed all Margaret's attention and support. When they arrived at the church for the funeral service, Margaret saw that Nicholas Higgins and Mary were there. She would have liked to talk to them, but felt unable to leave her father. Mr. Hale seemed to see nothing. He mechanically repeated the words of the clergyman, and at the end of the service he had to be led away as if he were blind. Dixon covered her face with her handkerchief, and was so absorbed in her grief that she did not notice that people were leaving until someone spoke to her. It was Mr. Thornton. It was Mr. Thornton. He had been standing at the back of the crowd with his head bent, and no one had recognized him. "I'm sorry, but can you tell me how Mr. Hale is? And Miss Hale, too?" "Of course, sir. Mr. Hale is very distressed. Miss Hale seems better than you would expect." Mr. Thornton would have preferred to hear that Margaret was really suffering. He was selfish enough to hope that his great love might be able to comfort her. But he was also disturbed by the memory of what he had seen at Outwood Station. She had been with such a handsome young man, and had seemed so relaxed and confident with him. What was she doing with a man at the late hour, so far away from home? All sorts of ideas went through his mind. Perhaps the reason why she was able to bear her grief was because of her love for the stranger. Mr. Thornton's face grew pale when he heard Dixon's answer, and he said coldly, "I suppose I may call and see Mr. Hale, I mean." He spoke as if he did not care at all, but although he hated Margaret at times, he desperately wanted to see her. For some reason, Dixon never told Margaret about her meeting with Mr. Thornton, and so Margaret never learned that he had attended her poor mother's funeral. Although to an observer, Margaret did not seem to feel much grief, her pain was in reality so great that sometimes she wanted to scream. What made her and her father feel even worse was that 2 days had passed and there was still no letter from Frederick. Mr. Hale was walking up and down the sitting room, desperate with worry, when Dixon opened the door to announce Mr. Thornton. He took Mr. Hale's hands and held them for a minute or two, his face and eyes showing more sympathy than could be put into words. Then he turned to Margaret. She did not appear better than you would expect. There was a look of great suffering on her face, and her eyes were red from crying. He had intended to greet her coldly, but he could not help going to her and speaking about her mother's death so gently that Margaret could not hide her emotion. She picked up her sewing and sat down. Mr. Thornton's heart beat fast. Mr. Thornton's heart beat fast, and for the moment he completely forgot about Outwood Station. Just then, Dixon came in and said, "Miss Hale, there is someone to see you." She looked so upset that Margaret immediately thought that something had happened to Frederick. Feeling sick, she followed Dixon out of the room. It's a police It's a police inspector. He's in he's in the study. Did he name? No, he just asked if he could speak to you. Make sure father does not come down. The inspector was a little surprised by Margaret's haughty manner as she entered the study. She showed neither surprise nor curiosity, but stood waiting for him to speak. I'm sorry, ma'am. Oh, madam. I'm sorry, madam, but I need to ask you a few questions. A man called Leonard has died at the hospital. He had an accident, a fall, at Outwood Station between 5 and 6 last Thursday evening. The fall was not serious, but because of a previous illness, the man's alcohol's habit, it killed him. Mm-hmm. Margaret's large eyes opened a little, but otherwise she showed no emotion at all. She said, Well, go on. There will have to be an inquest, said the inspector. He explained that a porter at the station had seen Leonard rudely push a young lady who was on the platform. She was with a companion who had then pushed Leonard off the edge of the platform. The porter said that he had not thought any more about the matter because the platform was not high and he had seen Leonard get up and run down the platform. A grocer's assistant who was on the platform thinks that the woman may have been you, madam, said the inspector, watching Margaret carefully. I was not there, said Margaret, expressionless. The inspector bowed, but did not speak. The grocer's assistant had not been sure that it was her, and he thought that she was probably telling the truth. Then, madam, you're going to show me that you were not the companion of the gentleman who pushed Leonard off the platform. I was not there, said Margaret slowly and heavily. Margaret's exact repetition of her words made the inspector suspicious. Frowning, he said, I may have to call on you again this evening and ask you to appear at the inquest. You may need to give an alibi. When Margaret's haughty expression did not change, the inspector decided that the grocer's assistant was probably wrong. It's unlikely, madam, that this will happen. I hope you will forgive me for doing my duty. Margaret bowed her head as the inspector walked towards the door. She opened it for him and accompanied him to the front door. Then she returned to the study, locked the door, and fainted. Mr. Thornton and Mr. Hale talked for some time. Margaret's father found Mr. Thornton wonderfully kind and comforting, and trusted him enough to tell him his most secret feelings. It feels like Mr. Thornton is almost like Mr. Hale's confidant. At the end of their conversation, both men felt much closer to each other. Mr. Thornton left the house and was walking along the street when he met the police inspector, who was called Watson. They knew one another, and Mr. Thornton had helped Watson get his first job. They greeted each other in a friendly way, and the police inspector said, I believe you were the magistrate who went to the hospital last night to hear the statement of a man called Leonard. He died several hours later. Yes, I'm afraid he was a drunken fellow, said Mr. Thornton. Well, sir, his death is connected with somebody in the house. I saw you coming out just now. Mr. Hale's house, I believe. Yes, said Mr. Thornton, looking at the inspector with sudden interest. What about it? There is some evidence that Miss Hale was the companion of the gentleman who pushed Leonard off the platform. A grocer's assistant who was there said that he recognized her, but the young lady denies that she was there at the time. Miss Hale denies she was there, said Mr. Thornton. Yes, she denied it twice. Since you are the magistrate who saw Leonard, it seems a good idea to ask for your advice. She denies having been at the station, said Mr. Thornton in a low tone. He paused and then said, "You're quite right to ask for my advice. Don't do anything until you have seen me again. It's now 3 o'clock. Come to my factory at 4. I will, sir, said Watson. The two men separated, and Mr. Thornton hurried to the factory, went to his office, and locked the door. There, he thought about every detail of his last 2 meetings with Margaret. She had looked so full of grief when he had seen her an hour ago that he had forgotten his suspicions. Now they were awakened again. Perhaps she was not as pure as she seemed. The thought came and then went immediately. But she had lied to the inspector when she was usually so truthful. What did she fear would be revealed if she told the truth? Mr. Thornton almost pitied her for the shame she must have felt to lie in this way. Suddenly he jumped up. As a magistrate, he could prevent the inquest. Then Margaret would not have to give an alibi. Even if she was in love with another man, he could still save her from being ashamed in public. He might despise her for lying, but he could still protect her. He left his office and went out for about half an hour. When he returned, he wrote 2 lines on a piece of paper, which he put in an envelope. He instructed a clerk to give the note to Mr. Watson when he came at 4 o'clock. The note contained these words: "There will be no inquest, as the medical evidence shows that there is no reason for one. Do not investigate further. The decision is my responsibility." Well, thought Watson, that means I don't have to do a difficult job. None of my witnesses seem certain of anything except the young woman. That evening, Watson visited the Hales' house again. Margaret had had a terrible day. She had decided to say nothing to either Dixon or her father about her meeting with the inspector, but lay on the sofa looking ill, only speaking when spoken to. She tried to smile when her father looked anxiously at her, but only succeeded in sighing. At 9 o'clock, the inspector had still not come, and Mr. Hale said good night and went to bed. Margaret was preparing to do the same when the doorbell rang. She answered the door herself and led the inspector into the study. "You're late," she said, hardly daring to breathe. "Well, I'm sorry to have given you unnecessary trouble, madame. They've decided not to have the inquest. So there will be no more inquiries," said Margaret. "I believe I've got Mr. Thornton's note with me," said the inspector. "Mr. Thornton's?" said Margaret. "Yes, he's a magistrate. Oh, here it is." Margaret took it, but felt so confused that she could not understand what was written on the note. She held it in her hand and pretended to read it. "I met Mr. Thornton this morning, just as he was coming out of the house," the inspector continued. "He's an old friend of mine, and he's also the magistrate who saw Leonard's last night, so I explained my problem to him." Margaret sighed deeply. She was afraid of what she might hear and wished the man would go. She forced herself to speak. "Thank you for calling. It is very late." He held out his hand for the note. And she gave it back to him, then said, "The writing is small, and I could not read it. Could you read it for me?" He read it aloud to her. "You told Mr. Thornton I was not there?" "Oh, of course, madam. I'm sorry to have troubled you. The young man seemed so sure at first, and now he says he was never sure at all. Good night, madam." She rang the bell, and Dixon came to show the inspector out. As the servant returned up the passage, Margaret passed her. "It's all right," she said, without looking at her. And before Dixon could say anything, she ran upstairs to her bedroom and locked the door. Then she threw herself on her bed, feeling much too exhausted to do anything but lie motionless. After half an hour, she felt a little better and sat up. Her first feeling was one of huge relief. There would be no inquest, and so there was no danger that Frederick would be identified as her companion at the station. She then started to try and remember every word that the inspector had said about Mr. Thornton. When had the inspector seen him? What had Mr. Thornton said? What had he done? What were the exact words of his note? Until she could remember every word in the note. Every word in the note. Her mind refused to go further, but the facts were clear enough. Mr. Thornton had seen her close to Outwood Station last Thursday night, and had been told that she had denied being there. Margaret did not tell herself that there was a good excuse for her lies, nor did she imagine that Mr. Thornton would be suspicious of the fact that she was with a handsome young man. There was only one thing that concerned her. The fact was that Mr. Thornton now saw her as a liar. She was a liar, and he knew it, and must despise her for it. She was a liar, and he knew it, and must despise her for it. Oh, Frederick, Margaret cried. What a price I have paid! What a price I have paid for saving you. She fell asleep with these thoughts going round and around in her mind. When she woke the next morning and the full memory of the situation returned to her, another thought came to her. It was because Mr. Thornton had learned about her denial that he had decided there would be no inquest. He had done this so that she would not have to give an alibi at the inquest. But if this were true, Margaret did not feel at all grateful, as it meant that he realized that she had done something very wrong. In that case, Margaret thought that he must feel great contempt for her. She hated the thought that he had saved her, and wondered what Lennox had told him. Perhaps he had told Mr. Thornton about Frederick, or perhaps Mr. Thornton had heard the story from Mr. Bell. If so, then the mill owner had lied to save Mr. Hale's son, who had come to see his dying mother. In that case, then she should be grateful to him, but she feared that he did not know the real facts, and only saw her as a liar who must be saved. Margaret had always seen herself as superior to Mr. Thornton. She was in a different position now. And felt very unhappy about it. She did not ask herself why it mattered so much to her that Mr. Thornton should despise her. Dixon knocked at the door and came in. "Here's something that will make you feel better. A letter from your brother." Margaret thanked Dixon, but waited until she was alone before she opened the letter. The first thing that she noticed was that the letter had been sent 2 days ago. It should have arrived the day before. Frederick wrote that he had seen Mr. Lennox, who had said that it was very dangerous indeed for him to have returned to England. But after some discussion, the lawyer had also agreed that it would be worthwhile finding witnesses who could tell the real story of what happened on the Russell. Then perhaps the trial could take place and the court would decide that Frederick was innocent. It seemed to me, little sister, wrote Frederick, that your letter made him very anxious to help me. He's an intelligent fellow. I'm not on a boat that will leave in 5 minutes. What an escape that was. Don't tell any. I'm on a boat. I'm on a boat that will leave in 5 minutes. What an escape that was. Don't tell anyone I came to England. Not even the Shaws. The Shaws is her aunt's family. Margaret could not have been more thankful that Frederick was safe, but the date on the letter told her that he had left England 30 hours ago. There had been no need for her to lie to the inspector and make Mr. Thornton despise her. But why did she keep thinking about Mr. Thornton? Why did she care so much about his opinion of her? What were these strong feelings that made her tremble and hide her face in the pillow? She dressed and took the letter to her father, who she knew would not pay any attention to Frederick's words about the incident at the station. Mr. Hale was very relieved that his son was safe, but was concerned about Margaret, who seemed very distressed. Poor child, he said, and made her lying down on the sofa and cover herself with a shawl. Through the day, he tried hard to be cheerful, and Margaret was grateful to him. Mr. Thornton had said that he might call that evening with a book for Mr. Hale, but Margaret knew he would not come, since he would be afraid of meeting her so soon after what had happened. She realized now that it was wrong of her to feel ungrateful. Oh, but she was grateful. It was a pleasure to her to realize how much she respected him. The book from Mr. Thornton arrived that evening with a kind note inside, but as Margaret had guessed, he did not come himself. He did not come himself. By now, she felt very confused. She felt great shame when she thought about meeting him again, but at the same time, she very much wanted to see him. But Mr. Thornton did not come the next day, nor the day after. This surprised and upset Mr. Hale, as Mr. Thornton had promised that he would call. Every time that the doorbell rang, both father and daughter hoped that it was the mill owner, but he did not come. And that's the end of chapter 10. So here we see, so Margaret starts to see Mr. Thornton's character and his kindness, and she feels so ashamed of her lie, and the fact that he had to protect her or to lie for her as well. So, well, it is a tormented Margaret here with her feelings, and we can have a sense now that feelings for him start to grow. It's growing in her. So yeah, it was a long chapter. Chapter 10 was quite a long one. I hope that you managed to keep up with the reading and stayed focused. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this live reading, this long session. Make sure you subscribe to the book club membership to attend the third live workshop session on the 2nd of November. So you have a bit of time and make up your mind to join us, but definitely, yes, have a go. I wish you a beautiful end of the day, and I will see you tomorrow for our live reading session 6 and to read chapters 11 and 12. Bye.